Day 343. I can't believe it's almost been a year. When we first started this journey, the year was brand new and hopeful. A lot has happened since then. Let's just hope this new year is brighter. It's not clear how much time I have left. I'm going to keep uploading as often as I can. It's just hard to say how close they are behind me, how many uploads have already been taken down. They definitely are disappearing at an alarming rate, but I don't have time to keep up with that. I just got to keep uploading when possible. I got to keep moving, upload when possible, and stay offline unless necessary. Just know that should I suddenly stop uploading or seem to disappear myself, I've hidden every answer I've found so far in every story, and I've entrusted my writings to someone important to me who I trust wholly, so that everything can be, well, so that I continue to be published whether I'm here or not. Alright? Whatever the case, let's just hope for brighter days to come. I like to think that's where we're headed. So I come to you today with the story of Pytheas of Massalia and some related myths and legends. I know I say it all the time, but it's just so wild once you start looking into this stuff, once you start down the path and start connecting the dots. All the parallels and ways which these stories connect all across the globe. And all across the globe is precisely where we're going with this. Just as people have been doing for a very long time. And maybe even longer than we might have originally thought. I'm J.M. Elgood, and this is Storied. (330 BC), the Greek colony of Massalia, what is now known as Marseille, France. Didn't know that the Greek had been that far that early on? Me either at first. I guess it's not that far when you really think about it. It is on the Mediterranean, especially once you hear the rest of the story. But just consider, even that is something to really wrap your head around if you weren't already aware. 300 some odd years before the Roman Empire and Jesus Christ appears on the scene, the ancient Greek were already well into Europe and colonizing there. But it goes a lot farther. So there was this guy from there by the name of Pytheas, okay? And he was a known explorer and geographer by the time he was in his middle age. I'm talking widely known. Yet you probably haven't heard of him until now. So why is that? The fact of the matter is, the detailed account for which he was most famous has not survived the sands of time. Whether it was lost simply accidentally or intentionally erased is up for debate, but I think considering our current circumstances, it's definitely a good question. The forces that work against us now do not sleep, and they have been working since long before then. But again, let's not waste time on them now, instead on shining a new light into the darkness. Alright, so Pytheas set out from Marseille or Massalia around 330 BC, like I said. He traveled west and out onto the Atlantic Ocean. Again, 330 BC. Keep in mind that the nautical understanding of people at that time was based on the behavior of seas and much smaller bodies of water. It was thought that beyond the Straits of Gibraltar and the horizon there, that there was nothing more after that. Okay, so this in itself is actually a wild feat, that he went out and sailed up on the ocean. And that's apparently the basis for the supposed title of his account, known supposedly by the title Peri tu Oceanu, which means about or on the ocean in English. And it also apparently differed from other nautical accounts at the time due to its narrative rather than purely technical style. All right, so these weren't just logs. Most nautical accounts at that time were just like notes. It was latitudes, longitudes, logs, like directions, if you will. But this was more than that. Pytheas told a story. So written in Greek sometime around 325 BC, around the time of his supposed return, it is likely to be the earliest documented description of the British Isles and its inhabitants. And we can suppose from the references that did survive that there was also evidence Pytheas may have reached as far north as Iceland and the Arctic Ocean. Some theorize he possibly even reached Greenland or North America, though these people were and are generally viciously discredited, as we so often see. It doesn't help having all sorts of kooks and conspiracy theorists hopping on any alternate history hypothesis as soon as it comes up as proof of their wacky ideas. Honestly, some people might even look at us that way. But I think that's exactly the point. Whatever the case may be, it often helps the cause of sweeping any alternate version of possible history under the rug and out of the public's view as even possible if you have a bunch of crazy people hopping on saying, you know, think like flat earthers and shit, right? Outlandish leaps of illogical conclusions. It gives alternate theories a bad reputation, and it's something they've been doing for a long, long time. Anyway, I personally don't think that Pytheas made it as far as North America. He supposedly only sailed for 6 days or so, maybe, about a week. Iceland is more likely. North America would have taken much longer. But there are striking similarities in some of the stories there in North America to the stories we find here in the Northlands, and things that Pytheas references. This is possibly because the Norse, I believe, may have actually made it that far, albeit a millennium and a quarter later. That is also still heavily debated. It's probably also something you may have never heard or even known was a possibility, but we'll get there. For now, we're going to stick with Pytheas and how far he got. I mean, maybe he did get there himself, but we can't just guess, right? We have to stick with the evidence we do have, however thin it might be. So most can accept that Pytheas at least made it to Britain. Well, like I said, some scholars believe Pytheas continued his revolutionary voyage by leaving Britain behind and venturing into the North Sea and possibly beyond. Now there's this other guy, Strabo, and he's one of our main sources of quotes from and references to Pytheas. But ironically, he was one of his main discreditors. He was essentially always quoting him to call him out, call him a liar and a fake, and a kook himself. But because of this, we get a lot of information from him, thankfully. So, according to Strabo, Pytheas claimed to have sailed for about 6 days before encountering a landmass he called Thule, which some scholars have identified as Iceland. Like I said, whether he actually made landfall in Iceland is highly controversial. Some have accepted it was Norway. There's this respected Canadian explorer by the name Stefansson. He explored the Arctic extensively and said that the possibility of Pytheas reaching Iceland was actually pretty credible. But either way, all right, I can't express this enough. This is more than 300 years before Jesus. It really doesn't matter if it was Iceland or Norway. Honestly, reaching either is an amazing feat. And the climate and culture in both places is rather similar. as a side note, just saying, but again, not the point. What's more interesting is that Thule wasn't just a name that Pytheas came up with out of nowhere, alright? Thule was the name of a mythical place to the ancient Greeks. So whatever it actually was, I don't think it's really the point. The point is that he went so far north, he eventually landed somewhere, and he encountered what he would only have been able to describe in mythical terms. So it was here that Pytheas witnessed phenomena that was totally foreign to his Mediterranean worldview, such as nearly continuous daylight experienced in high latitudes during the summer months. We have a quote from Pliny. Last of all those mentioned is Thule, where, as I have said, there are no nights during the solstice, when the sun is passing through the sign of the crab, and also no days during the winter solstice. Some believe this is true for 6 continuous months. Alright, so a day's sail north from this Thule, Pytheas further noted, would bring one to what he called the congealed sea, a term that scholars believe he used to describe the frozen Arctic Ocean. 300 years before Jesus, okay? At this point, it's most likely that the thick ice, fog, and just sheer cold prevented Pytheas and his party from going any farther north. However, he does reference this place in what some have called one of his most enigmatic passages. Again, from Strabo, we have the quote of Pytheas saying that this high northern latitude was a place where neither earth, water, nor air exist separately, but a sort of concretion of all these, resembling a sea lung in which the earth, the sea, and all things were suspended, thus forming, as it were, a link to unite the whole together. Spooky, right? But like I said, the ancient Greek-minded people at the time thought of these places and types of things as magical. These were mythical lands beyond common rational understanding, okay? And again, Strabo only quoted this to essentially say that Pytheas was making it all up. Now, Thule wasn't the only mythical place name ascribed to this region of the world. There was also lands up here that in Greek myths were called Hyperborea, occupied by a race of giants known as the Hyperboreans. In Greek mythology, Hyperborea meant something like beyond the north wind. The Greeks had a name for their god of the north wind, Boreas. In English, we get the word boreal from this, meaning northern, like boreal forests or aurora borealis. Okay? I have a note here that there was a group of beings in this Greek mythology for these winds, the gods of the wind, called anemoi. And I've never heard of it before, so I'm going to have to look into that in the future. But anyway, this was a land beyond the north wind, okay? And this land was supposed to be perfect, with the sun shining 24 hours a day, which we now know is a very real thing, right? It happens within the Arctic Circle during a certain time of year, and it's known as the midnight sun. It's also possible, though, that Hyperborea had no real physical location at all, and that it was sort of an idea, okay? According to the classical Greek poet Pindar, neither by ship nor on foot would you find the marvelous road to the assembly of the Hyperboreans. He also described some sort of an otherworldly perfection of the Hyperboreans. Never the muse is absent from their ways. Lyres clash and flutes cry, and everywhere maiden choruses whirling. Neither disease nor bitter old age is mixed in their sacred blood. Far from labor and battle they live. So some believed that Hyperborea was another dimension entirely, or like another state of being. Okay, so if you look at that quote, he's basically saying that, all right, so the sun's always shining, there's always beautiful music playing everywhere, and there's never any disease or old age, right? They have sacred blood. They live forever in peace and happiness. Far from labor and battle, they live. Okay, so they don't mess with any of that silly human stuff. Okay, they are happy and peaceful way up there beyond the north wind in a sacred land of sunshine and happiness. Okay, so you can see how that might just be like considered a metaphor for a different state of being. All right, whatever the case, beyond the fog of the north, another world entirely could be found. Now, this Pindar, as well as Pliny, Herodotus, Virgil, Cicero, they all reported that the people there lived to be over 1,000 years old and in complete happiness. That's just like a common theme. Okay, the sun rose and set only once a year. Again, if you put this into the Arctic Circle, which makes perfect sense, that's something that happens. Okay, you have the sun comes out for half the year and it goes away for half the year. Now there was another man though called Pytheas of Abdera, and he had collected all the stories about Hyperborea and the Hyperboreans, and around the same time or not long before Pytheas. But this was conveniently lost, and we only know it exists in the same way as Pytheas' account in references from other writers. Is this a coincidence? The fact of Pytheas' currently unheard of voyage taking place coupled with this whole mythology is where the major link occurs, and what makes this story so interesting, in my opinion. It ultimately links with other completely different stories from completely different mythologies of completely different cultures with completely different worldviews, okay? The Celtic deity figures that eventually became known as the fairies supposedly came from beyond the mists of the north, also from 4 such magical northern islands. They called them Murius, Phalius, Gorius, and Findius. This particular mythology features heavily in Tales of Bryn. The Norse have similar stories from what they call the elves. Think about it. Santa Claus and the North Pole ring any bells? A magical hidden land up here where immortal beings live in pure peace and happiness? This is part of why I thought it might be a good point to touch on at this part of it, with Christmas right around the corner. The stories all relate and go way back, like all the way back. They don't want me to tell you this for a reason, okay? Even many Native American tribes have stories of giants who may have come down from the north. Now, if you wanted to look at it from a more scientifically explainable view, I think we may be looking at something of a metaphor with this, maybe, for the great glaciers that pushed the land into shape during prehistoric times, before retreating back to these northern climes as the Ice Age came to an end. We know that prehistoric humans lived to see such massive occurrences, and also that they lived side by side with gigantic creatures of the animal kingdom as well. So maybe they passed these sort of stories down. It ties in with biblical flood stories too. If you consider that such a thing was likely the effect of or related to these epic scale-sized monoliths of ice and moving and melting. And the paradise idea, this whole other world thing. We keep coming back to the subject of this. This is the root of a lot of what we have covered here and in many of my fiction stories as well. Again, Tales of Bryn, that's a big part of it. Parallels can be seen here too, in the Genesis accounts of the Garden of Eden. You have stories of angels, demons, and jinn. Indian, Chinese, and other Eastern mythologies speak of another realm beyond the mists too, beings that might live there or come from there. So we have stories in every corner of the world that parallel each other. They all seem to be talking about the same thing or something similar. Whatever the case is, hopefully we're going to be able to touch on all of these links around the world in the coming uploads, God willing, should we make it that far. All around the world. On that note, circling back to the idea of around the world and the original point of this upload, right, the Voyage of Pytheas and his account of it. I want to talk for a minute about how there are plenty of other instances in history of people making it around the globe when they shouldn't have, or something like it. It's usually dismissed as rather pseudo-history or just flat-out false fantasy stories. Again, like I briefly mentioned earlier, the Norse possibly reaching North America circa 1000 AD. Again, which I hope to discuss in more detail with you in the future, and that's just one example. But perhaps this idea in itself, that people have been traveling all around the globe farther and for longer than we might have believed, this could account for the similarities and parallels in stories across the globe regarding the nature of this other world and its inhabitants. Maybe there's just been sharing stories for a long time, farther than we thought, for more outside of their own contained civilizations, right? Or maybe it's just as we thought. Like I said, we'll get to that in the next uploads, hopefully, God willing. Just remember that, like I said, though we now know that Pytheas' account was most likely entirely factual, many, if not most, of the respected voices at that time did the same thing. They called it all a hoax and a lie. Again, this might be the first time you're even hearing of it. So, whatever the case, I do only have so much time here now. I know I'm rambling. I have to get this uploaded to you and keep moving. So let me finish with the tale at hand and pray we make it to the next time to pick up where we left off. Before we do that, though, I just want to be clear about one more thing. While the forces against us have tried to make any of this information forgotten, to the wayside, or entirely discredited, one such way in which they have done this was for it to be delivered into the hands of very evil people, to attempt to use such mythology to their benefit. The Nazis and other subsequent nationalist and white supremacist racist groups have long tried to twist the mythology I've spoken of here into evidence that they were descended from a separate race of perfect heritage from these northern lands, such as Hyperborea and Thule. Okay? This is simply not true and is not what we are about here. Not only do we not stand for such evil racism, we stand firmly against it. We stand firmly against all forms of racism and nationalism. Our collaborator, C.R. Florence, has some great work in one collection entitled Always Punch Nazis, and another entitled Border X. Not only do I agree with the sentiment of both, but I would like to take a moment here to shamelessly promote their causes. Anytime we can help out a collaborator, we try to. And it's a worthy cause. So check it out if you can. I should say they're worthy causes, because there are two. Always Punch Nazis and Border X. Anyway, of course I'm taking more time than I intended, but it's well worth it. They aren't trying to silence us for nothing. I hope this and future footage reaches you. So back to the story of Pytheas. Remember him? Let's wrap this up. So returning from whatever it was he called Thule, Pytheas likely cruised down the east coast of Britain around Kent, which he called Cantillon, thus achieving a full circumnavigation of the island. Finally, instead of turning west and heading for home, there's evidence that Pytheas instead turned east and sailed along the northern coastline of Europe. There he encountered large estuaries and Germanic peoples that lived there, even more new things to him. He also made landfall on an island known for ample supplies of amber. In fact, this leg of the voyage into this part of Europe was most likely done by the desire to discover the source of this amber, which apparently was quite valued to the ancient Greeks. That original first leg of the voyage, where they landed in Britain, was likely to have been for sources of tin. Anyway, some say Pytheas even pushed into the Baltic Sea, may have even traveled as far east as the Vistula River, which is modern-day Poland, before he finally turned around back to the Mediterranean and finally home. Now, Pytheas apparently published on the ocean at some point after he returned to Massalia, like I said earlier, probably around 325 BC. And then soon after, it was first cited by students of Aristotle, afterwards supposedly widely circulated and apparently studied, argued, and just picked through for at least the next 2 centuries. Centuries, okay? So imagine you wrote a book and then people read it and studied it and argued about it for 200 years, okay? And then this, I might add, still leaves another century until Jesus shows up. All right, so this guy goes to the North Pole, mythical lands of Thule and Hyperborea, sees stuff that no one can even dream of. They're calling him nuts. And then they argue about it for 200 years. And then there's still another 100 years before Jesus is even around. And that was 2,000 years ago. Jesus. Anyway, for a long time, until the writing of folks like Julius Caesar, this account on the ocean was likely the only source of information about Britain in the northern latitudes. Okay, there wasn't like after he went, people were like, "Oh, let's go check it out," and they went. Okay, they studied what he wrote. So there were undoubtedly copies of it in all the great libraries of the world, such as the Library of Alexandria. This is yet another one of my favorite stories. Is the story of this library. Perhaps we can touch on that someday too. Over the centuries, however, On the Ocean was lost. Okay, perhaps as a result of neglect or accidental destruction, though I personally find this is unlikely. If it was so widely read and referenced, I think that deliberate destruction, unfortunately, seems to be more likely in the light of other evidence and our current predicament. So with its disappearance, an account of one of classical antiquity's most significant voyages was lost forever. We can only imagine what other information may have been held in those pages, just like the pages about the Hyperboreans collected by Hecataeus. And as for Pytheas himself, scholars know next to nothing about him. You have some very brief references by his discreditors, scorning him as a poor man and so on. But other than this, modern historians have really nothing from which to describe his personality, what he looked like, or even ultimately the true motivations for his voyage. Like I said, we can suppose they were after natural resources like tin and amber, but that's just the best hypothesis that we have. No one knows for sure. Such descriptions, if they existed at all, can only be inferenced, like I said, from other people's references to him, and usually references that are not positive. Whatever the case, what this all does reveal is that Pytheas was not only skilled in navigation and the ways of the sea, but also very curious, and curious in a way that pushed his world farther. Okay, and I think that that's something to be valued. While everyone else, even for centuries after, stayed living in that Mediterranean bubble, only venturing out by reading the words that he wrote, he went as far as you could go. He saw the magical lands. So I think that's something. there. Not only that, he had some pretty powerful things to say, including about how the moon had influence on the tides. Like I said earlier, the description of the midnight sun. He had an instrument with him in which he used to take precise measurements of latitudes and the distances, and he nearly got it spot on. He was off by a very small margin, and considering, again, the time and the technology, he was pretty close with, like the square footage of Britain, I believe, or at least the distance of the coast. Unfortunately lost the exact data there, but he took measurements along the way. He did. Do you remember how I was saying it was a story and not just logs? Well, he did also take logs, and they were like stunningly accurate, okay? And the fact that he was supposing that the moon had an effect on the tides, well, that was something that was completely, to the Mediterranean, they were like, no, that's whack. They didn't even again, they were like, what a nut. That's crazy. But he saw it firsthand. I mean, he went on the ocean and he went far and he witnessed it. Anyway, a few actual historians and scholars these days will doubt that his voyage actually took place. The debate does continue about the places he actually visited in specifics, like the particulars of the voyage, right? Where Thule was. Was it Iceland? Was it Norway? But I don't think that that's what matters. And the fact that he made such a voyage is rarely disputed, even if it's not something you're taught about. It's something that you have heard of until now. Basically, this guy exceeded the bounds of what was possible and brings to our attention some really interesting links. And that, my friends, is the story of Pytheas of Massalia and the voyage he took to the Arctic more than 300 years before Jesus Christ, as well as some of the links we can see in the mythology, not only from his own heritage, but from all around the world. I will try to get you more information as soon as I can. Let's hope that this, Storied, or even my fiction tales, which also hold valuable truth, let's hope that they don't end up like Pytheas on the ocean. Alright? We will do the best we can in that regard. Stay tuned for more uploads. Stay safe. Be kind. And have faith. Be good, see good. Right? God bless you and yours. This is J.M. Elgood, signing off.